dangerous at all, but compared with things like chemical industry, I remind you of Bhopal, or even very recently the train that derailed in Canada, or the fire in Texas. I mean, unfortunately, practically all industries have certain risks associated with them, and nuclear is not an exception of that. I don't think it's actually all that dangerous, and it's certainly not as bad in terms of number of people killed per year as, for instance, coal or oil and so on. I just want to point out that there is actually some similarities between what most green people, including myself, hope for in terms of renewable energies and nuclear energy. I mean, for instance, both of them are successful in countries where they are heavily subsidized. Germany has by far the largest fraction of non-nuclear clean energy, and it's very heavily subsidized. There's a big role to play for the government in both cases, because we do, in spite of what you said, we do need research to improve a huge range of aspects, technological aspects of clean energy, but also, we already have this nuclear waste. It has to go somewhere, right? Even if we were not to build a single more nuclear power plant, it has to go somewhere. So we need research into that, but I do think that we also need research into advanced reactor projects. I mean, we are still trying to figure out how to use fusion, and I can tell you one thing already, it's not going to be a panacea either. I was pretty disappointed in the end of the movie, which just sounded like right around the corner of A Brave New World, where the whole planet lights up. I actually find that very disturbing, being a hobby astronomer. I don't actually like that. I hope that will never happen, but it's also equally difficult, I would say, to honestly and seriously predict the future in which either nuclear, which is very capital intensive, or solar, which is also very capital intensive, can reach that point in short order. If you were to shut off all the nuclear power plants, even in Germany, you would immediately destroy all the progress that they've made there for clean energy, because you would have to immediately turn on exactly the same amount of coal plants, which is still by far the largest source of electricity, even in Germany. So my personal take would be, it would be definitely foolish to completely shut down all nuclear power production tomorrow, because the only way you can replace it immediately is with coal, burning coal. I also don't think that the problems that would be involved in scaling it up, like the movie would like us to do, are solved by far. So right now, I think we need to really do research. I mean, I'm a researcher, I'm always for research. We need to do research on all possible alternatives to fossil fuels.
Okay. Stay there. Trip he took, he actually flew his own plane, Paul Ehrlich did, to India for travel. I'm not sure what he was doing there. Maybe it was research on his book, I don't know. And he was at one point swarmed by Indian children who were begging from him. Large number, I don't know how many, dozens or scores of Indian children were swarming him. And he was so disturbed by this that he included the memory in his preface about the population explosion on Earth and how we can't sustain it. And Dr. Makhijani pointed out that in that single airplane flight from the United States to India, Dr. Ehrlich used a lot more energy than that entire group of children would use in their entire lives. And that same point was made by Indira Gandhi on the floor of the United Nations General Assembly when India was being lectured, and these days China. And we have a climate crisis, yeah, we have to address. But really, preaching temperance from Barstool, that's how that film ended, with Michael Schallenberger saying, all 10 billion of us can live the high life, and we pointed out the previous incarnation of propagandists from the nuclear industry, the the young generation in nuclear, which are nuclear engineers who are getting full ride scholarships, are looking at six-figure salaries when they start in the industry. We pointed out that they're pushing all this electricity use was kind of like a pusher, you know. And the point I made about Dr. Makajani's book is efficiency. We should be, that's the lowest hanging fruit of all. So I don't know how to answer your question. As Dr. Makajani pointed out in Carbon Free and Nuclear Free, he did not, one of his assumptions was that we do not have a net increase in morality in the world. And so what he's talking about is the current standard of living in the United States. Our economy, the number one in the world, can replace fossil fuels and nuclear power with efficiencies and renewables by 2040. And I should point out that Germany, the number 4 economy in the world, has committed to completely phasing out nuclear by 2022. They shut down 8 reactors immediately after Fukushima. They have 10 more or a dozen more to go. And if the 4th largest economy in the world can do that, and they also have very serious climate goals by mid-century to largely phase out fossil fuel use, then again, the planet can learn lessons from that. And I'll just close with the scenes of, you know, nuclearizing India, nuclearizing China. They could leapfrog this bad idea of nuclear power that we are still learning the bad lessons from 50 years later and go immediately into solar and wind to decentralize distributed generation. That would be a huge service to their societies.
Can we have one more question, then you can, and then after that question,
can either of you point to negatives about what France has done in the 80% of their electricity that they use now is from nuclear? Is there something wrong with that? It's a real life experiment.
you want to take that, Sebastian?
But let me just
We'll alternate.
make a quick comment about the future of 10 billion people. I mean, obviously, one good start would be not to have that many people on the planet. But apart from that, not only is it clearly important that we don't think that everybody else should just stay poor so that we don't have to build all these power plants, but we should also go into a direction of more electricity, right? If you ask people who really understand this, what is our best chance to get away from oil? It's electric cars, but for electric cars you need more electricity, right? So I think it would be nice if all of this can be done with just solar. I don't think that's actually the case. The French example is again one typical case. You pick somebody, you ask them what they think about nuclear power, and that can immediately predict what they will say about France, right? I'm sorry, I can predict that we will say, oh, there's a lot of pollution, there are a lot of problems, they're forced to sell their power below price because they produce so much, and some of it may be true. Right? I mean, France is actually, I think 80% is too much, because nuclear power plants are only efficient if they're on. Right? They can't be turned off efficiently. So they have to sell their nuclear power half the time because they can't actually all use it. And usually that's when other countries don't really need the power either, so they pay relatively low prices. There are definitely problems. I'm not saying that France is a beautiful example that we should all aspire to. But it is true that they have the lowest emission of carbon per person in the developed world.
Okay. All right, and another question, then you, Kevin, after this.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Kunya Sayanagi. I'm a physics PhD. I'm an assistant professor at Hampton University. So I have a lot to say about this. I'll try to keep it short, less than 10 minutes. So I'm glad that we all recognize that there's a problem, right? There's global warming happening. That's a problem. And then nuclear energy is not clean. We can all admit to it, right? We all recognize that that's a problem. But Kevin, I don't think you offered the solution, because nuclear power plant, one generator generates gigawatts of energy, right? One wind turbine generates kilowatts. There's an order of 4 difference in the energy production. So what you offered isn't really a solution to replacing nuclear. And then we all agree that we have to replace fossil fuel as well, right? And then there's a difference in the argument between shutting down nuclear energy today and whether to build more, right? The plants we have built so far is an investment we've already made. That's a gain we've made against global warming. So we have to keep those things alive to fight global warming. Whether to build more or not, that's a separate question we can ask, but we need to clearly differentiate those points. And then I'm going to address several of the points you brought up. You mentioned that nuclear energy is not a solution because it takes too long, but that's a political problem, not a technological problem. We have learned to hate nuclear energy because of a lot of media campaigning, and because of the images that have been generated through Chernobyl, through Miles, and then Fukushima, that it's dirty and scary. It takes long because of a political problem, not technological problems. So we need to differentiate those things. If we are determined to replace fossil fuel with nuclear energy, we can do it like France did. It's possible. It's not a technological problem. It's a political problem. We all need to learn that. And then you learn the proliferation issue. To build a nuclear weapon, you need to enrich the fuel to 95% degrade. That's what weapons-grade nuclear material is. But to build a power plant, you don't even need to get up to 10%. That's a huge difference in the technology needed. Iran already has nuclear electric production capability, right? But they are still struggling to make nuclear energy. Making a nuclear weapon is a lot, they're still struggling to make a nuclear weapon. There's a huge difference in the technology. It's not as simple as if you make nuclear power plants, you can build a nuclear weapon. There's a huge difference. You're not being honest on that point. Of course, when we start talking about dirty bomb, you can make dirty bomb out of anything, right? So that is something we still need to be afraid of. We need to be honest about that. But
I need to have you cut off because you're hogging the mic. We got too many people want to talk. So,
okay, so I'm just going to go back to
He's just making some good points here.
yeah, I know,
Give
but
him a
he's
few
not
more
one of
minutes.
our speakers. So.
Give him a few more minutes, please.
No, he's spoken enough.
So wind it up.
Okay, well, and I've already addressed the horrors of accidents you raised. You said that there's a horror of Fukushima accident. I'm Japanese. I'm a lot more. I speak Japanese. I read Japanese. I grew up in Japan. I know how bad it is, and then I want to hear what horror you're talking about because this is a media image, right? This is a radiation leak. Yeah, but what horror have you seen? Most of the destruction was done by the tsunami, not by the radiation. And then,
All right. So
Bye.
and then
I'll point
about
out
the
that
nuclear waste issue and mining issue. Those are real issues that you haven't addressed, but
Since you want a pro-nuclear speaker, you got me.
yeah. All right. Okay. All
All
right.
Just so everybody's on the same page.
I'll just close it with one point. You have not raised a solution to global warming, right? This is a problem we all agree with, and then that's one thing I'd like to close with. I'd like to hear a solution to.
Yeah, well, half of my talk was about the book Carbon Free and Nuclear Free. I've had 10 minutes. I drove 4 hours at 75 miles per hour, stayed in an hour-long traffic jam in DC to get down here. So just want everybody to know, I too would like a little bit of time, actually. So to answer some of these points, the France question, my main problem, because my focus is radioactive waste, is the issue of radioactive waste in France. France does reprocess. They're calling for reprocessing this film. We have a handout on the table, and I invite you to take all of our handouts because I don't have enough time to convey this information to you. So take our free handouts. One of the things that happens in France is an underwater pipeline from the reprocessing facility. They took the tour. It's all squeaky clean in there. You can eat off the floor there, right? They have an underwater pipeline where they discharge 1 million gallons of radioactive liquid waste into the English Channel each and every year. That radioactivity is flowed to the Canadian Arctic. There are a dozen European countries up in arms about the contamination of the ocean, the seafood supply. Things are not exactly peachy in France. What are they left with? Liquid, high-level radioactive waste. The government of Norway has done a study. What if the cooling were lost at these tanks of liquid radioactive waste in France, and they were to catch fire or to explode, Norway would be downwind of that. It would be an unprecedented catastrophe. There was a similar accident to that in Chelyabinsk, Siberia in 1957. The region is still uninhabitable to this day. So a lot of points were just raised. One counterpoint I would like to say, you asked for a solution to the climate crisis. You compared an atomic reactor, which, yes, are typically 1,000 megawatts electric. The new ones they want to build, the French version, is 1,600 megawatts electric. They were going to build it on the Chesapeake Bay. It's not going to happen now. So just recently, some very good news for people who care about the planet, care about the climate. The first floating wind turbine in human history in the world was just deployed in the Gulf of Maine. There's a professor at the University of Maine named Dr. Habib Dagher, who is behind this project. The entire project is not going to be a single turbine, and I don't know the exact megawattage of each of these turbines. But the entire project, which will take until 2030 or so to deploy in the Gulf of Maine, it's hard for me to believe this, but this is the case. It is a 5,000 gigawatt project, not a 5,000 megawatt project. It is a 5,000 gigawatt wind power project, floating wind turbines in the Gulf of Maine. That's 5,000 atomic reactors worth of electricity from wind in a single geographic location, the Gulf of Maine. There are about 450 atomic reactors in the world. This is 5,000 atomic reactors worth of electricity to be deployed in the next 25 years. Old reactors, quite a big risk being run. Look at Fukushima, a huge disaster. The price tag on that disaster is going to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. A little known fact is that Fukushima Daiichi Unit Number 1 had just gotten a license extension. It was built around 1970. It had run through its 40-year license. But instead of shutting down, it got a license extension. And it was the first reactor to melt down on March 13th or so. Actually, the meltdown probably began before the tsunami hit. There's mounting evidence that the earthquake alone commenced the meltdown at Fukushima Daiichi Unit Number 1. The only reason it was operating that day was because it had been granted a license extension. Takes too long. You seem to indicate that the anti-nuclear movement has somehow slowed things down for the industry. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is very captured. I mean, another example of that is the Marine Energy Agency of the U.S. federal government, involved in scandals a decade ago, and then the BP oil rig blows up in the Gulf of Mexico. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is a very captured agency that does backflips to do whatever the industry wants it to do, unfortunately. It's a rubber stamp agency. Proliferation, I think, was another thing that you raised. It's a huge concern. As I mentioned, Mohammed al-Baradei, whose job was to prevent nuclear weapons proliferation, who is Egyptian himself, who is a leader of the opposition movement in Egypt as we speak, he pointed out that the 13 Arab countries that are developing nuclear power are doing so that they have the option of developing nuclear weapons if they choose to. And finally, your question about the horror of Fukushima. I visited Fukushima Daiichi 7 months before the catastrophe. And I met the mayor of one of the host towns. I met the vice mayor of the other host town. They were polite. They listened to what I had to say. I spoke to a community gathering not unlike this that evening, about 50 or 75 people. Every single person I met that day, I was only there for a single day, one overnight, they are all nuclear refugees now. That's a part of the horror. 150,000 people who can not go home again. And their lives have been upended, to put it politely. There have been deaths during the evacuation from the radiation, especially elderly people, especially hospital patients, died during the evacuation. People have died in the refugee shelters. Dairy farmers have committed suicide and left suicide notes because their lives are ruined. They can't sell their milk. It's over. So there's a lot of horror to Fukushima, and it will go on for a very long time.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, yes, sir.
Is it 10%, 20%? And what are the isotopes of concern? And finally, for the Fukushima item, you said that there were several elderly people and others who died during the evacuation for the radiation incident. Did they die of radiation or did they die of being evacuated?
Yeah, well, Yucca Mountain, you need to check your facts. Actually, it's not a salt formation, it's a volcanic tuff formation. The leakage would come from, there's actually a lot of water flow. The site is actually quite saturated with water. If the tunnels were sealed and there were no ventilation, they would have near 100% humidity inside Yucca Mountain. So the corrosive atmosphere is the chemistry of the geology, things like chlorine and fluorine that are present in nature at Yucca Mountain, with a lot of water and a lot of heat. And again, only a part of the materials that would have been buried at Yucca Mountain, if it had not been canceled, would have been vitrified, liquid, high-level radioactive waste coming from places like Hanford. Most of it, though, would be solid irradiated nuclear fuel from the commercial nuclear industry, not reprocessed. And the corrosion mechanism is those containers you identified, the steel containers, would be corroded by the high heat, the moisture content, and the corrosive chemistry in the mountain. And in fact, if you go out to Yucca Mountain and you go straight south, about 20 miles or less, you've got a very vibrant agricultural community there. It's called Amargosa Valley, with the second largest dairy in Nevada. It's an organic dairy, actually. It supplies the Trader Joe's store chain. And eventually the flowing water it's used for irrigation water in that agricultural community. And eventually it surfaces in Death Valley. And this is all Western Shoshone Indian land by treaty right to begin with. So there would be a lot of people greatly harmed downstream out to a great distance. The gaseous releases from Yucca Mountain have something interesting in common with the French reprocessing plant. Carbon-14 gaseous releases from Yucca Mountain. Yucca's story is when it could not meet an environmental regulation or a public health regulation, they simply did away with it to keep that project alive for as long as possible. And one of those they did away with way back in 1992 was the gaseous releases of carbon-14, which among the radioactive isotopes, it's one of the most harmful biologically because it goes anywhere that carbon goes, which includes in our body, in our food supply. And it has a very long hazardous persistence, 5,000-year half-life. So you're talking 50,000 years of hazard. So that's how Yucca was kept alive for a long time, and the science finally caught up to the site. The French discharges, the radioisotopes of greatest concern are tritium, which is a clinically proven cause of cancer, birth defects, and genetic damage. That's a lot of the liquid discharge stream. But when you're reprocessing, other things are in that discharge stream. Another reprocessing facility in Britain, which also has an underwater discharge pipeline into the Irish Channel, has discharged 1,000 pounds of plutonium over the course of its operations. And that plutonium has been found in children's teeth out hundreds of miles, as far away as Belfast. And the plutonium concentration in children's teeth dissipates with distance. So when the facility tried to argue that this was atmospheric bomb test fallout plutonium, the dissipation of concentration with distance, that argument didn't hold water. And in terms of the deaths from Fukushima,
You didn't answer the second part of that discharge question.
which was,
What was the rise above background?
well, plutonium doesn't exist in nature. So a pretty significant rise in background in terms of that radioisotope. Carbon-14, significant rise because a big part of the gaseous discharge of the La Hague reprocessing facility is carbon-14. So a lot of these radioactive poisons...
Gaseous discharge wound up in the water discharge over into the English Channel.
No, sir, there is a liquid discharge pathway and there is a gaseous discharge
That's what I was
pathway.
talking about.
Other gaseous...
Tritium. What was the rise in tritium above background in already existing in the seawater?
In nature, surface waters often have 3 to 24 picocuries of tritium. That's from cosmic radiation, mostly. In the US, the regulations under the EPA, Safe Drinking Water Act, allow for 20,000 picocuries in drinking water. So that's a pretty significant rise. And that's mostly coming from artificial, as I mentioned, 3 to 24 picocuries per liter from nature. EPA allows 20,000. The US Nuclear Regulatory Commission allows 1 million picocuries per liter. So artificial radioactivity in the form of tritium in surface water and drinking water is a problem.
What was the rise for the French discharge above background?
I can give you that figure, sir. I don't have it at the top of my head, to give it to you. So, yeah.
So, I mean, I'm not trying to say that none of these things are actually not true, but what I noticed in a lot of the examples you give is, and that's, I think, the danger on both sides of the debate, is to use words that sound scary, but then not really put it in a perspective. I think what your persistence questions is getting to is that every one of us is exposed to something like 2 millisieverts of radiation, 4 millisieverts of radiation. If you live in Denver, 6, or I forget what the numbers are, every year. That's just unavoidable, that's there, and if you have any kind of medical condition, you probably end up getting a lot more if you get some radiological treatment. Tritium, I mean, it sounds scary, 20,000 picocurie, but you could also say that's the same as 0.000002 curie, and then it doesn't sound so scary, does it? In fact, a lot of old-fashioned exit signs contain something like 20, 30 curie of tritium to make them light. I'm not saying that none of these things are of any concern, but I think we need to be very careful not to just generate scary-sounding words and numbers.
Well, that's why I gave specific numbers.
And there was another question. How many of the evacuees from Fukushima died of radiation?
Well, that was an interesting line in this film, because if Gwyneth Cravens had memorized her propaganda lines correctly, she forgot to put the radiation line in there that you're putting in there. She said that nobody has ever died in a nuclear power plant accident in the United States, and she forgot to put that, finely honed propaganda word of radiation in there. Right here in Virginia, 4 workers died at the Surrey nuclear power plant. They were scalded to death by steam. They didn't die by radiation, but there have been deaths in the nuclear power industry in the United States.
How many died of radiation?
That's
what you were.
well, how many Navajo uranium miners have died of lung cancer? Do you have that figure at the tip of your fingers, like you're asking me?
How many of them were wearing their federally mandated breathing?
They weren't warned that there was a danger. They were sent down in the mines with no respirators.
When was that?
50s, 60s, 70s.
Okay.
When most of the uranium mining was taking place.
All right.
And now their families live next to the leaking mine
Another
sites.
questioner back here.
Go ahead.
Erica.
Yes, actually, I have a couple of questions. I noticed that in the movie, it didn't really talk about water usage. And evidently, we're going to be looking at water issues in particular. And nuclear power plants use a whole lot of water. And in cooling, especially in North Ann in particular, is a one cooling through system that puts out the water. I think the other day it's coming out at 101.2 or something. So obviously there's going to be some implications that has to deal with global warming and dealing with the water issue and needing to use so much water. But then also, the way the movie kind of implies is how clean and green it is. We obviously have to look at the water issue, and the vapor issue is the water usage. But at the same time, as it goes for the radiation issues and about deaths in radiation, I mean, in the health field, it's pretty much known that you don't x-ray a pregnant mother. And the reason being is because it causes chromosomal and DNA damage. So the real question isn't always how many people have been killed in nuclear power, but it damages DNA. So the very young and the unborn are particularly are in danger of radiation exposure. Obviously, in Fukushima, they raised it immediately from the 1 millisievert to 20. And now we're looking at 40% of the children in the prefecture having nodules on their thyroids, the ones that have been tested. So we can't just say, oh, everybody. It's the children, the pregnant mothers, and the unborn children, and the young, as their bodies are growing and the cells are dividing, that makes it so much different than someone older. So I don't like this take on, oh, how many people has it killed? It should be, how many people has it damaged? So I think between the water issue, which obviously didn't see a lot about, and I didn't see anything talk about the damage it does on a genetic level. And I think the other issue is I didn't see the uranium mines up there. And obviously here in Virginia, we have a foreign company that wants to mine uranium down in Southside Virginia, in Chatham, leaving us with 28 million tons of radioactive rubble that we'd have to watch over for eternity. And by the way, that fresh water comes down to Virginia Beach. So, and by the way, Dominion said that product wasn't for them, it's going to go on the open market. Make some money for some people and leave us with the waste. Sounds like a common theme. So we need to go the new renewable route, and it's safe for our children and our grandchildren and not leave us with toxic waste. Thank you.